This morning's reading from Rays of the One Light, Does Satan Exist? Truth is one and eternal. Realize oneness with it in your deathless self within. The following commentary is based on the teachings of Paramahansa Yogananda. The Bible tells us in chapter 4 of the Gospel of St. Matthew, then, after baptism, was Jesus led up of the Spirit into the wilderness to be tempted of the devil. To most modern minds, this passage seems quaintly obsolete. Psychologists would say, or have said, in fact, that the temptation of Jesus, if it occurred at all, was purely psychological. They call it a projection of desires lurking in his own subconscious mind. The subconscious mind plays a strong part, certainly, even if not a unique one, in any testing the spiritual seeker must undergo. The Bhagavad Gita, in dealing with this undeniable reality, quotes Arjuna in the 3rd chapter, and then Sri Krishna's reply. Yet tell me, teacher, said Arjuna, by what force doth man go to his ill, unwilling, as if one pushed him in that path? And Krishna replied, desire it is, passion it is, born of the darkness, which pusheth him, mighty of appetite, sinful and strong is this, man's enemy. Yet even Krishna describes passion as born of the darkness. The fact is, as Paramahansa Yogananda wrote in Autobiography of a Yogi, all thoughts vibrate eternally in the cosmos. Thoughts are universally and not individually rooted. A truth cannot be created, but only perceived. Psychology, yes, but psychology attuned to currents of consciousness that pervade the entire universe, attracted by each of us according to our own personal inclinations. Yogananda quoted in The Path and said, I used to think Satan was only a human invention, but now I know, and add my testimony to that of others who lived before me, that Satan is a reality. He is a universal conscious force whose sole aim is to keep all beings bound to the wheel of delusion. We should take pains then to attract uplifting currents of universal consciousness and to avoid attracting the negative which, disease that it is, can infect our thoughts even while it leads us to believe that our own thoughts are purely our own. And thus through Holy Scripture, God has spoken to mankind. Om. 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 Before I begin, I've got to get a little water. So there was a young monk, and he was going to join a particular order. So he went, and he was told that the order was such that he would go into seclusion for a whole year. And then he would be allowed to come out, and in that time that he came out, he was able to say one word, and one word only. So he went into seclusion very willingly, went into seclusion the first year, and he came out, and he turned to the head monk, kind of an old, stern, solemn man, and he turned to him and he said, cold. And the monk looked at him and he nodded, and the young monk went back into seclusion. And then he came out a year later and he said, hungry. And the old monk looked at him and nodded, and he went back into seclusion. 3rd year came, he came out and he said, tired. And the old monk looked at him, he said, nodded, and he went back into seclusion. The 4th year he came out and he said, I. And he went back into seclusion. And then the 5th year he came out and he said, quit. And the old monk looked at him and he said, well, thank God, because you have done nothing but complain ever since you've been here. You know, when I think of Satan, I have to think of Flip Wilson. Some of you may remember him, and he always used to say, he was the judge, the devil made me do this. Well, I don't think he was too far off. Swami Kriyananda, at one point in time, well, when he was quite young, actually, he was 23 when he joined the monastery. And he was young and very curious, and he spoke with a friend of his, Boone, who was one of the monks there, and Boone told him about his experiences with demons. And he also told him that what Master said about the Bible and possession, that it was real, that there was a lot of truth to it. And so this piqued Swami's curiosity even more. And naive as he was at that age, he wanted deeply to have an experience of evil or of Satan or of a disembodied spirit. So a few nights later, he went into sleep and he had a dream. And in this dream, he was at a party and he was with his friends. And he saw off in the distance there was a room, and in the middle of the room was a light bulb, and the light bulb was bright, very bright and brilliant, and the room had nothing in it but this light. And then he saw on the other side of the room a door, and he saw through that door, and what he saw was darkness, complete darkness. So he went into that room and he was drawn towards the door, so he decided to go through the door. His first instinct, he said, was to turn on the light, but he ignored it. And so what he did was stand in the center of the room and say, "Come," because he knew, he could feel it, that he was about to meet a disembodied spirit, disembodied spirit. And simultaneously at that time, there was one of his friend monks, his name was Jean Haupt, was in his room and he was asleep. And he heard a knock on the door. It was actually a banging on the door. And he heard this deep, raspy voice. And it said, "Who's in there?" And Jean said, "Jean Haupt." He said, "Well, I don't want you. I want Donald Walters." And then Jean said he heard him leave the building quickly. And Kriyananda said he stood in the center of the room again and he said, "Come." And he knew, he felt this presence press against him and try to pull out of him his conscious awareness. He said he left his body. He can still remember the room. He said the floorboards and the walls just went in and out, vibrated in and out. He saw a mist all around the room, a gray mist, and he heard an kind of a perverted sound of Om. He said it sounded awful. It didn't sound quite like Om. And he thought, again, in his naivete, first he thought, I'm not going to turn on the light because I'm not a coward. I'm not afraid. I want to face this. And so, again, he said in his naivete, he thought to himself, well, isn't this interesting? And then he felt that this force was so strong, he couldn't overcome it. So he said he best not go much further with it, and he called out Master's name. And he instantly said, he woke up, sat up straight, no influence at all with this entity anymore. And myself, I've had an experience, not like this, but it was a little different, where I was working at the seclusion retreat at Nanda Village many, many years ago. I was very willing that day. And I was just jumping into everything, full-hearted enthusiasm, my feet just moving, my body just working hard. I was cleaning cabins all day long. And I got home that night and I literally was exhausted. My mind, my energy, everything had just left. And I lay down on the bed, and in about 30 seconds, I felt this unbelievable energy just come in and lift me up. And I felt like I could have gone and done the whole day all over again. Well, the thing to remember is that there are always those forces working with us and against us. And actually, Swami gave a definition of Satan. And he said it's a conscious power of evil which influences mankind by blocking his attempts to grow spiritually. And he also obstructs man's sincere efforts to increase the influence of goodness in the world. Kind of interesting, especially today's day and age. I mean, we all know it's really, really quite interesting, and it's hard not to see that there's very strong influences of light and dark working with each other. Now, the one thing that Swami also said after his dream was the next day he brought it up to Master. And Master said, yes, that was real. That was a real experience, and sometimes it happens to us on the path. He said, but don't be afraid. And Swami said, or thought to himself, how can I be afraid knowing that you're by my side? And Swami asked Master, what are the two qualities that that are the most desirable for spiritual growth? And Master said, it's devotion and sincerity. And he related a story where there was a woman who had, she was 80 years old, and she had been an atheist all of her life. And she came to Master, and she converted. By the grace of God. She met Master when she was 80, and she converted. And Master said that when she was not meditating, she was chanting or listening to his tape, his recording of God, God, God. That's Master's poem, God, God, God. And if from the depths of slumber as I ascend, the spiral staircase of wakefulness, I will mentally chant, whispering, God, God, God. Thou art the food, and when I break my fast of nightly separation from thee, my soul cry will always be, God, 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 and serving, meditating, chanting, divinely loving, God, God, God. So she would say that and hear that all the time. And he said she lived a few years longer, but she liberated that lifetime. And that was sincerity and devotion. So we have these two forces that are fighting against us. You know, we look at them and we think they're the devil or Satan or evil, whatever you want to call it, and the angels fighting against us or working with us, either in this lifetime or in the next. But that God is so much bigger than darkness and goodness. And God created Satan. Satan is that force which tries to keep us down, tries to keep us in the first and the second chakras, trying to keep us stuck there and attached to matter consciousness. And we have to be diligent right now. We have no choice, really, if we want to survive these times. And willingness, the affirmation willingness, how important that is. To just say, yes, I accept whatever you're giving me. I accept it. You know, Master said that the last thing we should do right now is call ourselves sinners, because we identify with that when we do that. He said, because remember, there's a piece of gold with layers and layers and layers of mud on it. But the water comes over it and washes away those layers. And still, what's underneath that piece of gold that cannot be destroyed? And that's what we are. We've got to remember that. And how do we do this? How do we keep moving through times like this? Well, affirmation is one. Prayer is another. Affirmation, God, God, God. If you can say to yourself in the morning, one morning I was, this years ago, I heard this voice right before I woke up. And I heard it say, get up. Well, now, I'm not one to jump right out of bed usually. I roll over, I hit the snooze. It's not that easy for me. But I heard that voice that one morning, and kind of went, oh, huh? What? Oh. Get up, and I got up. Well, let me tell you, if you can say to yourself, the first thought of the morning is, I am positive, energetic, enthusiastic, it can change your whole day. That's how much power affirmation has. And Master said that, you could go, he said people would come to him and they'd start complaining about his organization. And he said, I can look up one side and down the other, and I can tell you every single thing that's wrong with this organization. But I don't choose to focus on that. If you can't even do that, have you ever heard the story about the man or the woman that they had a terminal illness? And so what they did was they went home and they started watching all these movies, like Laurel and Hardy and all these comic movies, and they laughed. If you do nothing else, laugh these days. Don't let it get you down. You gotta laugh. You gotta keep yourself uplifted however you can do it. And if watching a movie that makes you uplifted is all you can do, or a comedy, do it. To get your consciousness shifting in that direction. All of us don't have these dramatic experiences, of what Swamiji might have gone through. Ours might be more subtle, but that's Satan. He's extremely subtle. It's like when you're sitting there and you're on a diet, and you know that you should not be eating this particular food, but you decide, well, okay, I'm going to just try it. So you give in that one little inch, and then you just say, oh, come on, I can have a little bit more. I have a little bit more. I can start tomorrow. How many days does that happen sometimes? Till tomorrow never comes. Well, that's like Satan. That's like these radio stations that Master talks about. We tune into these radio stations, and which radio station are you tuned into? You have this particular thought, and you look at it, oh, that's interesting, let's follow that. When your conscious is saying, don't do that, but you follow it anyway, and then it gets harder and harder to resist it. You need to cut it right in the very beginning. One of the other things to do is energize. Energization, these are techniques that Yogananda teaches. He said if he were on a deserted island, that would be the one technique that he would want. It can uplift your consciousness in an instant. So when you start to feel down, just do your toes and your feet. Just start moving in that direction. Just have the willingness to move in that direction. And prayer. Prayer is extremely important. I was raised in the East Coast. So, it was pretty tough when I was a kid. and as I got a little older. So I've had to over Master's grace. It's tempered a little bit, thank God. But one of my biggest is driving. So when I'm driving, I have had kind of an East Coast mentality. Well, if you were ever in the East Coast, we don't have great drivers here. I'm not going to say Sacramento's got the best drivers. But when you're in the East Coast, you can be sitting in a lane, which I remember one time I was with my cousin, and a taxi basically decided he was going to do a U-turn. This is in the middle of New York City. We're in the left lane, and he decides he's going to turn and do a U-turn right in front of us. We're at a light right in front of us and go down the other side of the medium. That's East Coast driving. So you grow up and you have a pretty strong response to a lot that's going on with driving on the East Coast. And so now, over years, over time, I've learned, pray for people. And it will make a whole different experience for you. When you're on the road, you see somebody cut you off, they run a yellow light, start praying for them. Maybe pray for their safety, their connection to the divine. We've got to start doing that for each other. You walk down the street, you might see a homeless person, your first thought might be, oh my gosh, why aren't you paying taxes? What's wrong with you? Start praying for them. So prayer is extremely important right now, but pray for the will of God. That's even more important. Thy will be done, not my will. Let's don't make this earth the way I think it should be. Let's look at what's trying to happen here. Let's try to see what God's trying to do. There's a story by St. Francis. I did a talk last week, I think, Friday night on St. Francis. And I love St. Francis. Yogananda thought St. Francis he always referred to him as his patron saint. And Francis, to me, is like the epitome of what we're kind of going through right now. I feel sometimes like we live in the Dark Ages. And so St. Francis was so dramatic. He was such a interesting example for us, and a strong example, almost to the point where you just think, oh my gosh, he would beg for his food, he would sleep on the ground, and one day he was out with Brother Leo, a good friend of his, and his confessor, and also he was his scribe. And so they would be out on a walk, and it was snowing. And they were cold, These guys were out there with no shoes. This was not an easy trek for them. So he's out and he's, walking along, and he says, Brother Leo, take this down for me. He said, if the friars minor are revered and get everybody's attention, he said, that's not perfect joy. And then he kept walking. He said, brother, write this down. He said, if the brothers can heal the lame, if they can give sight to the blind and give hearing to the deaf and enable those who can't speak to speak, and if we can even raise the dead, he said, that's not perfect joy. And then he walked some more. And he said, brother, if we understand everything scientifically, if we just understand the whole universe, in other words, if we understand the animal, thieves, you're awful people, you're trying to hurt everyone, and he doesn't recognize us. And we look at him, and with humility, with patience, and with love, we accept it. We take it. And then we leave, and we come back. And then again, he looks at us and says, who are you? You're scoundrels. You're nothing. You're not the brothers. And he takes a big stick, and he starts to hit us. And we're wet and cold and hungry. And he says, with humility and patience and love, we accept this. He said, that's perfect joy. St. Francis was in a shed, a small shed with his brothers, and that's where they lived. And this man came along. They lived on a leper farm. And they were in this enclosement that was nothing, a shack. And this man came along and he had a donkey, and he said, "You have to get out." And he kicked them out, literally. And he said, "This is for my donkey. This is not for you." And he put his donkey in there. And Francis accepted it, had his brothers told him just to accept it. And he learned that, as Swami said, he always learned to accept what God gave him, and he always found that God had what was right. The plan that he had was always the right one. And from that point, St. Francis went and lived at the Portiuncula, and he had was given land and given housing for the monks. And from that point on, his work began to grow, and brothers started coming to him by the hundreds, and then eventually by the thousands. There's a story I was just told about a couple at Ananda village, and they were having problems with their water heater. So they called a professional out. And when he got there, he told them that he went into where the heater was, and there was a flame, and he said there was a lot of dry leaves, and then there was a couple little mice, and they had built a little nest. And then what they did was they chewed through the wires, and that stopped the flame. And he said, if they hadn't have done that, your house would have burned completely because of these dry leaves that were in there. So like I said, yes, there's the good, there's the bad, but God is so much greater. And we don't know his plan. We really don't. So we have to look at it with patience, with humility, and with love, and with enthusiasm. And sometimes I'll be the first to admit it's not that easy. So don't beat yourself up over it. Give yourself a break. Give your friends a break. Give your family a break. Let's give each other a break right now. There's a lot going on. Okay.